We begin with news from the Ministry of Foreign Affairs saying that other countries with similar circular with Ukraine have offered Nigerian students whose programs were interrupted by the Russia-Ukraine conflict admission to the ability to complete their studies either online or physically. Speaking at the 36th session of the State House briefing today, the Minister of Foreign Affairs, who led a delegation, disclosed through its permanent secretary of the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, Gabriel Aduda, who also said that Nigeria still maintains good diplomatic standing with Russia in spite of its condemnation of Russia's special military operation in Ukraine. According to him, all admission processing will be conducted through the Nigerian mission to authenticate students who were previously enrolled into various programs in Ukraine. A former president of the United Nations General Assembly, Tijani Mohamed Bande, further mentions that Nigeria is willing to accept educational opportunities from Russia because both countries are not at war and there is need to strategize a balancing act that is synonymous with diplomacy. And the UN Secretary-General Antonio Guterres is scheduled to meet the Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky today. On Tuesday, Mr. Guterres visited Moscow and held talks with the Russian President Vladimir Putin. UN Secretary-General Antonio Guterres today also toured Kyiv region towns of Borodyanka and Bucha that were shelled and occupied during Russia's offensive in northern Ukraine before it withdrew to focus on the east. He said civilians were paying the highest price in the war. According to him, the UN will continue the work to expand humanitarian support and secure the evacuation of civilians from conflict zones, urging for an end to hostilities.
There is no way a war can be acceptable in the 21st century. Look at that. I imagine my family in one of those houses that is now destroyed and black. I see my granddaughters running away in panic, part of the family eventually killed. This horrific scenario demonstrates something that is unfortunately always true. The civilians always pay the highest price. Innocent civilians were living in these buildings. They were paying the highest price for a war for which they had not contributed at all.
Secretary General Jens Stoltenberg says the military alliance is ready to support Ukraine for years to come in the war against Russia. Speaking at a youth summit in Brussels, he said there is still absolutely the possibility that this war will drag on and last for months and years. NATO countries, alongside countries that are not part of the alliance, met in Ramstein, Germany earlier this week to discuss how they can support Ukraine's defense and security. The NATO chief said Ukraine's allies are preparing to provide it with NATO standard weapons.
Ukraine, and we need to be prepared for the long term. So we will continue to put the maximum pressure on President Putin to end the war by imposing sanctions, by providing economic support, but also military support to Ukraine. And we need to be prepared for the long term. It's a very unpredictable and fragile situation in Ukraine, but there is absolutely the possibility that this war will drag on and last for months and years. So NATO allies are preparing to provide support over a long period of time and also help Ukraine to transit or move from old Soviet-era equipment to more modern NATO standard weapons and systems that will also require more training.
Thank you so much, Mr. Secretary General. Thank you to all of you for your questions. Thank you for all the work you're leading.
Thank you.
Well, the U.S. president is at the moment outlining his plans to offer more support to Ukraine. He says he will ask Congress for $33 billion in military, economic and humanitarian assistance to support Ukraine for the next 5 months. The package includes more than $20 billion in military aid, $8.5 billion in economic aid and $3 billion in humanitarian aid. The White House has proposed giving the government greater power to seize and sell the assets of Russian oligarchs and transfer their proceeds to Ukraine. The legislative proposal will be presented to Congress for consideration. It follows similar legislation recently passed in the U.S. House of Representatives. But the new White House plans go further, focusing on collaboration between Justice, Treasury, State and Commerce departments. The measures will make it easier for the U.S. to seize and sell oligarchs' assets and use the funds to remediate harms of Russian aggression. This is coming from the White House. Joining us now is human rights activist Olatunji Barua, who joins me virtually. Thank you for joining us on the program.
Thank you for having me, Millicent.
First off, the UN chief is striving for cooling down tensions and peacefully resolving the Ukraine crisis, visiting Russia Tuesday, and now he's in Kyiv. But is this working?
My answer, unfortunately, would be no, even though I encourage this kind of intervention, this high-level intervention by high-powered bodies like the United Nations. And we would also like to see other organizations, other countries like the United States being able to sit at the same table with both the Russian president and the Ukrainian president to resolve this crisis. But the intervention is encouraged, it is welcome, it is very good, it is encouraging. But at the moment, whether this will solve the problem, whether it will stop the shelling, stop the humanitarian crisis that is falling out of this, I'm not very positive about that.
But looking at how the United Nations has played its role, and this is in the past and perhaps this present war, do you think there was something they could have done to forestall things getting to this point, the aggression in Ukraine?
Yeah, unfortunately, you know, the United Nations, we will all naturally feel that the United Nations is the most powerful multilateral body in the whole world, and they should be able to rein in, you know, these kind of aggressive tendencies by, you know, powerful actors across the globe. But unfortunately, also, Russia is a permanent member of the UN Security Council with a veto power, and that makes it pretty difficult for the United Nations. The United Nations cannot function when the veto authorities within that body are becoming the aggressors in conflict across the world. If you make move to sanction Russia, Russia will veto. If you make move to sanction the United States naturally will veto. If you make move to sanction China, even with what is happening in, you know, there's a region of China where there are Muslims, you naturally expect that China will veto that. And if you have a veto at the UN Security Council, you can't move forward with those kind of actions. So the UN naturally should have been the ultimate body to solve this. But unfortunately, the UN is incapacitated in the way it is set up, and it cannot solve this kind of crisis. But also, you also have to look at the other side of the coin, that the Russian, if you look at the manner in which Russia assembled troops at the border of Ukraine, you will know that it was fait accompli from the beginning. There was nothing that was going to stop Vladimir Putin from, you know, sending troops into Ukraine. You don't just, the logistics of pulling 150,000 to 200,000 troops at the border of another country, combat troops, artillery troops, everybody, missiles are all there, everybody, the mechanized division, all of them were all lined up at the border of Ukraine. The logistics for doing that alone is expensive and it's cumbersome. And you don't just do that if you are fooling around. It was imminent. It was an attack. It was an invasion that was imminent. There was nothing anybody could have done to stop it. Russia was trying and going to make a statement. But how far they have gone, well, if they have achieved their ultimate goal, their initial objectives right now, I do not know, because this has also come with huge costs to the Russian military.
Well, perhaps they really haven't, because they are warning with outside interference into what they call their special military operation. But we've seen, you know, an overwhelming majority of refugees as a result of this invasion. How would you say the rest of the world, especially the immediate community, which would be Europe, has reacted to this humanitarian crisis?
It's been very positive, actually. The response from Eastern European countries, the response from Poland, you know, I once read out the statistics that in at the peak of the Syrian conflict, the total number of refugees that emanated from that was just about 10% of what we had even within the very first month of the Ukraine-Russian crisis. So when you look at this, you see that it is actually a very complicated one. Hungary, Moldova, you find Bulgaria, you find Poland. They've been at the receiving end, receiving refugees, taking care of those refugees. How long this hospitality will be sustained is also, one that comes with a question mark. Because even if you're willing, you will need resources to keep this going on. And I know that a lot of European countries have been coming together, releasing funds, mobilizing for funds to help Ukrainian refugees in all these countries. But it's going to get to a point where you have to now look, it's going to be beyond even the host countries, even the psychosocial problems that comes with this for refugees in itself, for displaced Ukrainians, for their children, for people who have lost livelihood, not able to, students who can't go back to school, who have to now, who are going to go through a whole round and lots of process to return to school, to find a source of living. Is going to be really complicated. It is tough, and it's going to get tougher as the weeks come by, as the months come by. This conflict doesn't look like it's going to end soon.
The UN is saying that another Ukrainian child is becoming a refugee nearly every second, and that more than 1 of every 2 Ukrainian children are now being displaced. I believe my question is really how indeed they can be protected, seeing as most of them have fled to some of these neighboring countries which you've mentioned, and they have been welcomed by governments and also by communities. But we also know the steps that Russia has taken in the very recently, which is yesterday, to Poland and Bulgaria. Do you see them, what's the word now, with regards to what they're doing to help those in Ukraine? Do you see them, do you see any concerns now in, their actions towards Ukrainians or those fleeing the war in Ukraine?
You've talked about children. You've also talked about, the actions the Russians are taking, which is also further exacerbating the crisis. Ukrainian children will find it's going to be a very tough, long journey for the children. And, you need a whole lot of care for kids at this level. When you have over 4 million children have been displaced in Ukraine at the moment. And that's supposed to be more than half of Ukrainian children. And that is a big problem. When you look at children are usually the focus of development plans. They are the future of every country. When you cause displacement of these kids, you displace them from school, from their life, everything is distorted for them. Now it's now like an arrested childhood for them. But there's a whole lot that is going on. I don't think that alone will solve the problem. It depends on how far the countries that are hosting them are going to absorb them, re-educate them, put them into the school. And I know certain parliaments or legislators in some countries are already passing law to absorb them, to give them easy passage so that some of them can get into school, their parents can find work and all that. So that's on one hand. But when you look at the action Russia is also taking, further exacerbating the crisis, cutting off gas supply to Poland, to Bulgaria, Russia is even trying to open a new frontier for this war in Moldova, in Transnistria, or whatever, that particular strip around Moldova that borders Ukraine. So you find that this doesn't look like it's going to end soon. Now you look at the statement issued by the Russian authorities earlier in the week. They wanted to also cut off the southern Ukraine, cut it off totally, cut Ukraine off from accessing, the Black Sea. And that is going to be a whole lot of complication that you cannot find answers to right now. It's not going to end soon. The children are in for a long one. Their parents are even going to be in for more, because parents can, some parents are in their 40s, 50s. You can't restart your life. You have 10 years to retirement. You cannot, everything you have built and labored for had been blown into shreds, into rubbles by the bombing caused by Russia. How do you restart that? How do you rebuild that kind of life? How do you rebuild a house? How do you rebuild businesses? You can't even return into your country. That's complicated. The parents will never find their way back. They will I don't see them coming back from this. Some will come back, but the children still have long future ahead of them. So many of them will still thrive. So many of them just need the right mental and psychosocial support to thrive, to be reintegrated into society, to find jobs, to get education, and then launch themselves. And most of them will be the one that will ultimately rebuild Ukraine.
And NATO is promising a sort of long-term support. We're also getting, affirmations, and this is over this period, from the United States. Are you optimistic with the kind of help and the packages, the aid that they are providing at this time?
You can't blame people who have attributed this as a proxy war between Russia and the United States, because the kind of funding, the kind of support, both military, humanitarian, that has come from the U.S. has been very significant. It's impressive. I'm particularly excited, especially about the humanitarian intervention. But when you also look at in the news, you read earlier, U.S. is providing about $20 billion worth of military support to Ukraine and NATO countries. And that is to tell you that this is not going to end soon. They want to wear out and wear down the Russian army. And then you see, if you imagine all the sanctions that come upon Russia, they cannot easily rebuild their military. So many of the components that they will need to rebuild, military equipment, are not going to be readily and easily available to them right now, except through China. And even that process is going to be complicated and cumbersome. So Russia will be able to, hold its own in the short term. But rebuilding is going to be a problem for Russia if this conflict linger on for months or years to come. And the rest of the Western nations are rallying around Ukraine. They are providing everything that is necessary to withstand the giants and the bullying of Russia in this particular instance. So it is the way it is, and I know that the support will not stop coming. $20 billion is a lot of money. That's bigger than the Nigerian budget for the year. So you have to, you should see that this is not going to end soon.
Let's come back to Moldova and what we're seeing, especially what we've seen in the past 24, 48 hours. Humanitarian workers there say they're working with partners to support refugees who are there. And we also know that they have tightened their security following the attack in Transnistria, which isn't far off. What are the likely situations for refugees there, those who are making their way there from Ukraine? Is this a time to leave or remain?
It's double jeopardy. It's between the rock and the hard place. And I think right now, a lot of people will start moving, because if you look at how this conflict started, Russia are massing troops at the border and saying, we are not going to invade. We are not going to invade. And then a Russian military commander said earlier in the week they want to cut off Ukraine from the south, cut off the entire southern Ukraine, cut access of Ukraine to the Black Sea, meaning that they will not be able to. So once they create a corridor around there, it means Transnistria will also be part of, the territory Russia is mapping out for seizure. So what it also means is there's going to be, if likely, if possible, if needed, Russia will shell Moldova. Moldova has a total of about 6,000 soldiers in its military. I don't think they can withstand the Russian. A Russian advance into Moldova will be a disaster. And as it stands today, refugees who are going in there will right now also be mapping their way out of Moldova. And I know that humanitarian bodies, UNHCR, the OCHA, everybody, Oxfam, everybody right now will be working on how to create another pathway out of Moldova for these refugees, knowing fully well like there's an imminent crisis looming in the horizon. Russia may come for Moldova, and the moment that happens, it means another round of shelling, double jeopardy for refugees, and that's going to be very tragic indeed.
We really hope it doesn't get to that as we continue to follow developments there. We would like to thank you, human rights activist Olatunji Larry Barua. Thank you so much for joining us on the program.
Anytime. Thank you for having me.